All right, Colossians chapter 2. I want to start in verse 1. I'll read down to verse 5 this morning. And the lesson, of course, will be out of verse 5. So the Bible says, Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 1 then. For I would that you knew what great conflict I have for you and for them at Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love, and unto all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God and of the Father and of Christ, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Verse 4, and this I say, lest any man should beguile you with enticing words. For though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the spirit, joying and beholding your order and the steadfastness of your faith in Christ. All right, a couple of things to kind of remind you of as we get started in the lesson this morning, because we're going through a series out of the book of Colossians, and so it kind of becomes important for us to remember where we are, so that we can so that each lesson kind of connects with the other. So you'll remember a couple of things that we've seen as we've gone through this study in the last little bit. Number one, you'll remember that Paul was not the one who had planted the church at Colossae, and the indications are that he had never even been to the city. So he's never been to this church. He knows some of the people that are members of the church because they've come to see him. And those who know these things much better than me say that what would have happened is that what would have happened like this, that the Apostle Paul had started the church in Ephesus. He's in Ephesus for a good length of time, and while he's there, it's the economic center of the area, and those people in outlying communities and towns would have come to Ephesus to do business, legal business, and economic business and so forth. So they would have come to Ephesus, and while they were doing that, Paul led some of them to the Lord, and some of those that he led to the Lord went back to their home in Colossae and planted a church there. One of them, the two people that we know by name, are Philemon. The church appears to have been, Philemon appears to have opened his home to be the place where the church would meet. And then Epaphras looks like he becomes the pastor of the church there at Colossae. So Paul knows some people, and he may know some others as well that have been to Ephesus over the course of time, but he only knows, but he doesn't know everyone there, and makes mention of it in chapter 2 and verse, what is it? Verse 1, where he says, you know, that many of you haven't seen my face in the flesh. And so many, if not most, of the members of the church there at Colossae had never met him personally. And yet Paul says to them that even though he's not met them personally, that he has great conflict for them. That he's laboring for them, he's striving for them, and that he is in a great conflict for them. You'll also remember, as we've gone through some of these lessons so far, you'll remember that this church has an issue with some heresy coming up in it right now. There's a doctrine that has crept into the church that the pastor, Epaphras, is concerned about. And he's concerned enough that he has gone to the Apostle Paul and asked the Apostle to help him correct this doctrinal error, this heresy that was creeping into the church. The heresy is the indication from, although the word isn't found in the book of Colossae, the indication from the things that are taught here is that it's the heresy of Gnosticism. Bless your hearts, you know, you mean well, you just don't know as much as I do. And the Gnostics believed they were of a kind of an elite spiritual status. And, you know, when the average person just wasn't bright enough, sharp enough, didn't have enough on the ball to catch these deeper spiritual truths. And so these people had come into the church at Colossae, and they're trying to infiltrate the church and bring in their false doctrines, and under the guise of being more intelligent, using enticing words, deceiving people with enticing words, acting more intelligent, and they're better speakers, more articulate, and those kind of things, and trying to draw people to themselves and into their false doctrines, because by using these enticing words and by elevating themselves and making themselves seem like they're more than they are, and others would want to be drawn to them because, boy, this guy is on this spiritual plane, and if I follow him, I'll get on that spiritual plane. And our pastor, well, he's still down on ours down here, and he doesn't speak so well, and he only had a little bit of time with the Apostle Paul, and we don't even know that the Apostle Paul was an apostle and all that. And they're doing those kind of things and trying to pull people away from the church and into their heresies, and so that's going on in the church. Now, one of the things that seems like it always happens when people begin to question a doctrine. If a person begins to question truth, one of the things that almost always happens when a person begins to question a doctrinal truth, and remember, if you're bringing in a false doctrine, in order to embrace a false doctrine, you're going to have to reject a true doctrine. And one of the things that happens every time, in my experience, every time, when a person begins to reject a doctrine, they also reject the person who taught them the doctrine. It comes kind of hand in hand. If I teach you something and what I teach you is false, then not only are you going to reject what I teach, but you're going to say, well, you're going to begin to question me as a teacher and, and my qualifications. And if he's got that wrong, what about these things? And there's some questions that are happening in there. And, and you can always kind of tell that when people begin to question doctrines, they begin to express less and less respect and regard for the people who've taught them and teach them things. One of the things, just in my experience, I remember my pastor telling me this when in fact, back probably around the same time that Mount St. Helens blew up. I had only been going to church for a few months. My pastor is Fred Scudder, and he had started Cornerstone Baptist Church in Kennewick, Washington. That's where I was attending church, where I was a member, got baptized there. And I can remember one time he and I went on visitation. We'd go on visitation together each Thursday night, and we visited this family that had been coming to our church for a considerable length of time. And after the visit was over, we got into the car, and pastor said, what? And what's that about, Pastor? And he says, he called me Fred. And Pastor said this. He said, generally speaking, when a person loses respect for their pastor, they stop calling him pastor and start addressing them by their first name. Now, to be honest with you, I don't really care whether a person calls me pastor, preacher, Marvin, Brother McKenzie. It doesn't matter, really. I've gotten over titles, and that kind of stuff. I've gotten over it. However, it is something you just kind of, it does tend to ring true. When a person begins to call me by their first name, they usually mean it in a disrespectful way. Almost always, they're meaning to demean, to belittle my authority by changing from Brother McKenzie to Marvin, or pastor to Marvin. Almost always, I can't say it's true in every case, and it wouldn't be true in every case, I'm sure, but very often what's happening is they're beginning to question my authority, my qualifications, and my leadership in their life. And it's almost always a sign that pretty soon they're not going to be in church. It's just worked that way pretty often. So anyway, it looks like that's what's going on here at Colossae, that, here's a church that was planted by one of Paul's preacher boys. Some of the people in the church are beginning to question the doctrines that the Apostle Paul taught Epaphras. And the Apostle Paul is going to now address those errors and try to bring truth back into the church. But he starts out by kind of addressing some of the first early objections that these people would have had. And it's as if Paul is anticipating their objection, because he says in verse 1, well, many of you haven't seen my face in the flesh. You've never met me. And yet, I say that I have a conflict for you. And it is as if Paul is anticipating their objection, of the objection of this questioning party in verse 5. And he writes, for though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the spirit. And it's like, he's anticipating that they're saying, how can you have any personal conflict for me when you've never met me? How can you care for me if you've never met me in the flesh? We don't know one another. How can you really love me? How can you really care at all for me? And how can you care what I believe and what I don't believe, and what we're learning and what we're not learning? And you're here writing this letter and acting like you're an authority and acting like you're somebody who can help us and you want to help us, but you've never met us. How do I know you mean anything at all? And so Paul it's like he's addressing this question of the people saying, well, you don't know me. How do I know that you care for me when you've never met me? And he says, for though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the spirit. So I've never been there, but I still do love you, and I still do care, and it still matters to me what's going on in your church. And some of you'll no doubt have some experiences like that too, where there's people in other places right now that you don't see them, you don't know what's going on in their life, but you still care for them and you're concerned for them, even though you're not looking at them today. And maybe you have family members that you know mom and dad, or you have an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, and you've never met their children, but you still love those children even though you've not met them, because you love their parents, and you have that kind of a relationship. The same thing is true in the church in Newport, and the same thing is true in where Caleb is this morning, and in Anacortes, where Bohannon is this morning. I do not know the names of all of the people who attend the church in Anacortes, and some of them I've seen, some of them I haven't seen, but I care for them and love them and pray for them, and it matters to me what happens. And so the Apostle Paul says, listen, I can tell you for a fact that I have a great conflict for you. Even though I've not seen you in the flesh, I care for you, and I am under a conflict for you, because though I am not present in the flesh, in person, I am with you in the Spirit. And I'm praying for you, and I care for you, and that's what Paul is saying in verse 5 when he begins this passage. Though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the Spirit. He goes on from there. From a distance, he says, he has kept an eye on what is happening there. He cares for Epaphras, and he cares for Philemon, and he cares for the saints of God in general, and he is praying for them, and he does have a conflict as to whether this church embraces the truth or goes into heresy. It does care about those kind of things. And so that's what he means when he says, though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the Spirit. And then from there he says there are two specific things. When he thought of the church at Colossae, there were two specific things that brought joy to him in relationship to this church at Colossae. He says there's two specific things that caused him to rejoice and brought joy to his heart. He said, number one, he rejoiced in their order, and number two, he rejoiced over the steadfastness of their faith. And so I want to take a look at those two aspects, or those two areas that he mentions today, things that Paul says brings joy to him. And I'd like to suggest to you that whatever brings joy to the apostle brings joy to God, who inspires the Apostle Paul to write these words. So while it is the Apostle Paul who says, these things bring joy to my heart, I think it is right for you and I to read that what's happening, the same things that bring joy to the heart of the Apostle Paul bring joy to the heart of God. And that's what we're learning in this passage of Scripture. Number one, he says that Paul says, I rejoiced in your order. Mentions that in verse 5. For though I be absent in the flesh, yet I am with you in joy, in the Spirit, joying and beholding your order. So he speaks about the word order there. Now, let me just give you a quote from John Gill. Gill was a Baptist pastor in London in the 1700s. And here's what he wrote. He said, the order of their church, he's talking about what it means, the order. He says, the order of their church discipline, they having regular officers, pastors, and deacons ordained among them, who rightly performed their offices and had respect and subjection yielded to them. The ordinances of the gospel were duly administered and constantly attended on. The members of the church were watched over. Admonitions were given. Censures were laid where they were necessary. And everything was done decently in order, which was a beautiful sight, and gave the apostle uncommon pleasure. And so he's describing what the Apostle Paul means by the word order. When he says, boy, I joy and behold your order, what it's speaking about there is the way they conduct their church, how the church is conducted and how it operates. Our world doesn't like order very much anymore, does it? Strong's Concordance says the word order means the arrangement of things, to have things in a fixed succession, so it's 1, 2, 3, and to do things in a way that provides dignity. When things are done decently in order, they have dignity involved in them. I can't help as I think about this, George Washington, who was considered such in his own lifetime, people considered him above men, above the common nature of man. And the reason for it was because as a teenager, he had gotten a hold of a book of 120 some rules just on how to behave yourself, on good behavior. And he had taught himself, he had memorized it, but he did more than memorize a bunch of rules. He practiced those rules, and so that by the time he was an adult, people recognized him as being a man of uncommon dignity. And there's great stories about him. He was tall, big stature anyway, but great stories about him. I think it was Hamilton and one of the other guys where they were in a constitutional convention and Washington's on the other side of the room, and these two guys are talking, and one of them says, I'll bet you dinner that you won't go and tap George Washington on the shoulder. I mean, now these are adult men. These are grown men, leaders of what's going to become the United States of America. And number one, they're doing childish pranks. Number two, they're all afraid of George Washington. And so the one, says, I'll take that bet. And he walks up to Washington, he taps him on the shoulder. And they said Washington turned around and just stared at him. Because you didn't touch George Washington like that. And just stared at him. And didn't say anything, just stared at him. And the guy walked back to Hamilton or whichever one it was and walked back and said, I won the bet, but it wasn't worth it. And all Washington did was look at him. And the reason he had that, it was because of the dignity. He dressed well. He carried himself well. He had taught himself how to behave. One time he's in a conversation with a guy, and the guy says, I can tell by your expression I've upset you. And Washington said, no, you can't. I don't make expressions. You can't tell whether you've upset me or not because I haven't done anything to let you think that you've upset me. And that kind of, he always wanted to have an expression that was even and calm and always looked like he was in charge and those kind of things. Dignity, order, dignity. And our world really doesn't care for that very much anymore. I was thinking about last weekend, Mother's Day, after we changed our plans on Mother's Day. After the service, Mother's Day, we were planning on going just home. My wife and I and Caleb and his family were going to come to our house, and we're just going to have a barbecue, for Mother's Day. But after the service was over, we were all tired and got to talking, and so we decided instead that we were going to go take our wives out to eat. But where are you going to go? On a Mother's Day, Sunday afternoon, Mother's Day, right after church, where are you going to go that you're not going to be waiting for 3 hours in line? How are you going to do this kind of thing? And so we all threw out our suggestions. And finally, we all agreed on one and said, let's go there. And Anita, immediately, as soon as we said, let's go there, Anita says, we should call and make reservations. And that's what I ought to do, is we should call and make reservations. I say to Anita, I said, they probably don't take reservations. And see, because Anita was trained formally, and where many parents, have their kids enroll them in baseball and soccer and all those kind of things. My wife's parents enrolled her as a child in classes on etiquette. So instead of going and kicking a ball around, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with kicking a ball around, but instead, my wife was taught from a child. She would go to formal dinners, and they would dress up formally, and they would sit at a formal table, and they would have to learn from a child how to put silverware in the right place, and fine dishes and things like that, and how to use the right dishes and things, and have everything just right, and and all of those kind of things. And when we first started dating, she liked those kind of things. She was trained that way and liked those kind of things. So she always wanted to go to the places that you had to get reservations. Of course, being the man, women never want to make the reservations. That's part of this thing, is that the men are supposed to be the leaders, and anything that's got dignity and order, the men are the leaders of the thing. And so she, we would agree on a place, and she'd ask me to make the reservations. And so we've been married 33 years now. For 33 years, she's expected me to make the reservations. She never calls to make reservations. She always asks me to make the reservations. And so she doesn't know nobody takes reservations anymore. The nicest restaurants, probably if you go to like places I would, if you belong to a club, they have a restaurant in the club, you probably have to get a reservation of those kind of places, but you have to buy a membership in the club before you can get the reservation anyway. And so that's out of our ballpark. I haven't been to a restaurant in years that really accepted a reservation. It got us to talking, because she said, well, it's Mother's Day, they might this weekend. For 33 years, no one's taken reservations. For 33 years, I've called about reservations. And still, last weekend when I said, no, they won't take a reservation there, she says, well, they might on Mother's Day. She wants them to take a reservation. Because that's, formal, dignity kind of thing. And we got in the car afterwards. They didn't take a reservation. And it's just first come, first serve. And if you get here real quick, all the other churches aren't here yet. And so if you get here quick, you'll beat them all. And, so we got in the car race. As we're driving, though, we got to talking about that, and that no one takes reservations anymore. And about how things have changed over the course of the years of our marriage. When we got married, you still could call us some steakhouses and call in a reservation and get a reservation. And there were places when we first got married that, you wanted to check on the dress standard. They didn't let you in blue jeans. And you had to, some of them you had to have a tie on. Guy had to have a tie on to get in. He wanted to check on those things to, if you're going to go on a date and you're going to go to this place, you better make sure they're going to let you in the place before you go. And you want to check those things. Now the finest places, are very seldom black tie only kind of places anymore. And our culture is less and less inclined to do things in an orderly, formal, dignified way. We don't think that way anymore. Our culture is changing. So I'm thinking about illustrations of this, and I was talking to Brother Davis about this the other day. And because when I'm thinking about this message and getting ready, my mind, I'm thinking George Washington, and I'm thinking military. I mean, if there's anything you think about when you think of military, you think of order and dignity. The uniforms, the spit-polished shoes, everything in exactly the same place. All of the decorations, medals, and things like that. All of it has an exact spot it's supposed to be. Everything has to be just exactly right, and it's for dignity. It's to give it honor. There is an honor in fine dress and clothing and behavior and all of that. There is a dignity involved in order. So I told talking to Brother Davis about that the other day, I said I was going to call you and ask you a whole bunch of questions. I know he and his wife, he was a military officer, and his wife was involved in teaching the wives of other officers, the formal things and so forth. And I wanted to talk and ask questions, and he said, yeah, in those days when I was in, we used china and silverware. Now they just use paper plates and plastic forks. Even the military has kind of dropped their standards on those kind of things, apparently, and so forth. But my point of all this is that while our society has become less organized or less accustomed to organizing things for the sake of dignity, God's Word has not changed. And a lot of churches now cater to the less structured kind of culture. And, you got the come as you are. Used to be, when I first became a Christian, those churches that advertised come as you are, that used to be an invitation to people who were unchurched. But now it's an expectation of the churched. It used to be that you'd say, anyone can come and you'd feel welcome here. Anyone should feel welcome in the church. Now, the church people are saying, you have standards? The people who are the most mature in the church saying, what? Things are changing that much. Music has changed over the years. Music has become less and less, and I don't know the right words because I'm not a musician. I don't know the right words, but music has become less composed. The only illustration I can think of is Handel's Messiah, which was written for the purpose of teaching doctrine. And it's I don't know, it take 2 or 3 hours for the whole Messiah to go through the whole Messiah and the entire thing, but every note has a purpose. Every piece of timing and half note and quarter note and however every rest, all of it has a purpose. And people who are trained in music and music theory understand that there is a purpose for everything that's done in music. But music today is not written with the same kind of training and style. Now you just get a guy like me. What I do is I just pick up my guitar and the first 3 easy chords to play. That's how I do it, and I just make sure everything fits in the 3 easy chords I know. And music is changing. It's changing. It used to be that everyone knew how to read music. Almost everyone knew how to read music. So you come to church, everyone pick up a hymnal, and there's music, and everyone knew how to read the music on the page, and they could read it and sing parts because they knew what it meant when they're looking at it. And today, very, very few of us know. I mean, some of us don't even know how to find, the pages. I didn't when I first started going to church. They say sing hymn number 185. Who knew that hymn number 185 was not on page 185? It's a whole different thing. And things have just changed that way. Care and respect for church facilities have changed these days. Been replaced by kind of this coffee shop atmosphere in churches. And I don't necessarily think it's all wrong. I do tell, we don't, kick people out, but I do not care for the idea of coming into into an auditorium with a cup of coffee or your mouth full of gum or whatever. You're in the house of God, and it's still the house of God. But things are just changing. We're not thinking the same way about things that we used to. And if we admit it, we just don't look at church services as something that has dignity anymore. It's just not the way we think. We expect our pastor and guest preachers to tell jokes. We think nothing of talking about whatever we want to during the service, during the singing, or during the preaching. If we just talk about what we want to. Over the years of preaching, I've had some of the funniest. I'm preaching. I've had people picking their teeth, flossing their teeth, clipping their fingernails while I'm preaching, because they just don't see they don't see that there should be dignity in the services. And the Apostle Paul says, one of the things that I joy when, I know I'm not there, but one of the things that I joy when I consider that church in Colossae is your order, that you do things in a kind of a dignified manner, and you do things that are right. And I don't mean anything negative about how things have changed so much, other than just to point out that we don't put as much stock in dignified things as they used to. And I will admit that some pomp and circumstance, in fact, a lot of pomp and circumstance can be carried way too far and become something on its own, and it can become far more than it's supposed to be. For instance, Catholic masses done in a language that no one can understand because Latin is more dignified than another language, or Protestant liturgies where you have to have a manual during the service to know when to stand and when to sit and when to kneel and when to say whatever your part is. The pastor's going to say this, and you're supposed to respond, and everyone's going to say the same words at the same time, and all of those kind of things. That's taking it too far. That's taking the idea of order too far. Or the old fundamental practice when I first started going to church, not any of the churches that I attended, or that I was a member of, but some churches that I attended for special services. They'd have on their doors signs telling on the doors into the auditorium, signs saying what kind of clothes were not permitted in the building. And that's taking it too far. That's just taking it too far, and it's not what the Word of God is trying to get at here. But let's not say, because some people have taken it too far, let's not overreact and go too far the other way, where we have no order, and where everything is casual, and where in fact we despise order because we think of it as being something that is that has gone too far. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 40. Let all things be done decently and in order. And the word in order there, it doesn't mean that you just do things where you don't have a ruckus going on. The word order there, it means the idea of doing things in a way that's dignified.